The scent of Italian jasmine lingered in the cool evening air as Richard Albright stood at the top of his Beverly Hills mansion, looking down at the sprawling city beneath him. A world of ambition and lights, reflecting the very empire he had built. The mansion, standing tall with over 40,000 square feet of luxury, was a symbol of his success. Albright Dynamics, the company Richard had transformed from a small startup into a global leader in artificial intelligence, had made him a wealthy mogul. At 45, Richard was revered in the business world, hailed as the architect of the digital age, a man who had conquered every challenge that came his way. Yet as Richard gazed down at the city lights, there was no glint of triumph in his eyes. Instead, they carried an unease, a feeling that something vital was missing. His life, filled with accolades and millions, had become a shiny veneer that hid the deep emptiness he felt inside. The world knew him as a man who had everything, yet, at home he was a stranger to the one person who mattered most, his daughter, Clara. Clara, just 9 years old, had been born blind due to a rare condition. Since the tragic helicopter crash that had taken his first wife, Emily, 4 years ago, Clara had been struggling with severe anxiety attacks. Every doctor, every specialist Richard consulted seemed to fail her. And despite his immense wealth, his resources and influence were powerless against his daughter's emotional turmoil. Richard had tried to focus on his work to escape the pain of his personal life, but it never lasted. The truth was, his heart ached every time he saw Clara, alone in her dark world, struggling with fears that Richard couldn't understand. The anxiety, the constant screaming, the helplessness, it all weighed him down. Yet, he remained distant, believing that as a father he simply didn't know how to fix it. That afternoon, as he sat in his office, Richard's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a call from Thomas, his chauffeur, a man who had been more like a loyal confidant over the years. His voice trembled with concern. "Sir, Clara's having another severe episode. Mrs. Vanessa is, well, she's struggling to handle it. She says she's overwhelmed." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. The pain in his chest was familiar, a knot that never quite loosened. He thought of Clara, alone upstairs in the chaos of the mansion, and suddenly, he knew. He had to leave the comfort of his empire and face the situation that he had long ignored. Driving through the gates of his mansion, he could see staff rushing nervously, deliberately avoiding the second floor where the screams often echoed through the hallways. Vanessa's voice rang in his mind, her irritation and indifference to Clara's struggles making it clear that Richard was on his own in this. Vanessa, his second wife, was an accomplished woman in her own right, polished, beautiful, and perfect in the eyes of society. But to Richard, her coldness toward Clara felt like a betrayal. The thought stung deeper than he was ready to admit. As Richard pulled into the driveway, the sight of the massive mansion that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, one where his daughter's pain was hidden behind wealth and appearances. Richard's footsteps echoed through the grand entrance of the mansion as he hurried inside, the weight of the call still heavy in his chest. His mind raced, thoughts of Clara's unrelenting anxiety pulling him in every direction. The mansion, once a place of pride, now felt like a cold and distant shell. Staff moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, whispering as they rushed through the expansive corridors. The marble floors gleaming in the daylight seemed to amplify the chaos inside. The large Spanish-style estate was more than just a home. It was a monument to Richard's hard-earned success. But as he entered, the sound of staff scurrying and the silence from above filled him with unease. His heart raced as he climbed the grand staircase, only to be stopped by the sharp voice of Vanessa from the top of the stairs. "Richard, thank goodness you're home," Vanessa said, her voice cool, but with a forced smile. She wore her usual ivory Valentino gown, which Richard knew cost more than most people's annual salaries. Her polished appearance was the image of perfection, yet it clashed with the distant, almost cold aura she projected. It was as if she was trying to maintain a facade that wasn't real, not even for their daughter. "I need to leave for the Spanish Hospital Charity Gala," she continued, glancing at her watch. "Clara's condition is completely out of control. I've called Dr. Ramirez 4 times today already. Richard was taken aback. How could she talk about their daughter this way? She never once mentioned Clara's name, always referring to her condition as it or the condition, a dehumanizing way to distance herself from the reality of Clara's suffering. Richard's heart tightened. Clara was his daughter, and Vanessa's indifference stung him more than he could admit. What happened with Clara today? Richard asked quietly, hoping for a more compassionate response, something more than dismissal. The same as always, Vanessa replied with an exaggerated sigh. She sounded exasperated, almost as if Clara's needs were an inconvenience. She was at it again, rocking, banging against the walls. Honestly, Richard, I think she only does it to get attention. Children are far more cunning than we give them credit for. The words hit Richard like a slap. Vanessa's complete lack of empathy for their daughter's suffering struck a chord deep within him. How could she possibly think that Clara, who had been born blind and suffered from anxiety attacks, was faking? Clara had no vision, and the world was a terrifying, uncertain place for her. Yet Vanessa couldn't see it, couldn't feel it. To her, Clara was simply a problem to be solved, a burden on her perfect life. Before Richard could respond, a piercing scream erupted from Clara's room, followed by the crash of something heavy slamming against the wall. Richard's heart raced, and he immediately dropped his leather briefcase, his legs carrying him up the stairs before Vanessa could stop him. Wait, Richard. Sometimes it's better to let her calm down on her own. Vanessa called after him dismissively, but Richard wasn't listening. His daughter needed him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. As he reached the top of the stairs, something unusual stopped him dead in his tracks. The screams had ceased, replaced by the sound of something else. A soft, melodic voice filled the space, the gentle hum of a lullaby being sung in Catalan. The song seemed to hang in the air, filling the mansion with a sense of calm Richard hadn't experienced in months. Richard felt a deep stirring inside him. There, in the quiet of the mansion, he realized something. Clara was no longer crying, no longer thrashing. The atmosphere had shifted. It had gone from chaos to peace in the span of a few moments. But how? Who was singing? Richard hurried toward Clara's room, his heart pounding in his chest. He hesitated as he reached the door, which was slightly ajar. Through the narrow crack, Richard could see a heartfelt scene that stunned him. Clara, still teary-eyed, was sitting on the wooden floor, leaning against the wall. In front of her, a woman in a simple maid's uniform was kneeling, her presence calm, almost ethereal. She wasn't rushing to fix Clara's condition, but rather, she was simply being with her, singing in a soft, tender voice. Her hands moved gracefully, as if cradling something delicate and precious, a spiritual connection that went beyond just worst. "Do you feel better now, Clara?" the woman asked softly. Clara, still hesitant, looked up. "I feel better. Who are you?" The woman smiled warmly. "My name is Isabella. You can call me that if you'd like." Richard stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. He had never seen Clara respond like this to anyone, especially not a stranger. Clara, usually so afraid of new faces, was leaning toward the woman, drawn in by the gentle presence Isabella offered. The healing effect of Isabella's presence was undeniable. Clara, who typically recoiled from others, was now reaching out, responding to Isabella as if she had found a safe haven. It was a moment Richard could never have expected, and yet it made everything shift inside him. Isabella was doing something Richard had never been able to do. She was bringing peace to his daughter, not through medication, but through love and empathy. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a glimmer of hope, something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Isabella had given him a glimpse of a different way to approach the challenges in his life. Not through force, not through medication, but through the simple act of being present, of listening to Clara's needs, of meeting her where she was. "Thank you," Richard whispered, his voice breaking as he stepped into the room. "I don't know how, but Clara has stopped crying." Isabella bowed her head slightly, her expression humble. "Sir, I have no magic. I only know how to listen." As Richard sat down near the window watching his daughter with a new sense of gratitude, he realized how much he had overlooked. The true healing didn't come from fixing Clara's condition. It came from seeing her as a whole person, a gift, not a burden. In that moment, everything began to change. Richard sat quietly beside the window, his eyes fixed on Clara. For the first time in a long while, he noticed the way she gently touched the air as though feeling the room around her, her small fingers reaching for something beyond the darkness. The lullaby Isabella had sung still echoed faintly in his mind, and the change in Clara's demeanor was unmistakable. She was calm, her anxiety no longer driving her into distress. He turned to Isabella, who was now standing by the door, her quiet presence almost blending with the peaceful atmosphere she had created. There was a serene strength in her, something that Richard had never truly seen in anyone else before. She wasn't just a nanny to Clara, she was the calm in the storm, the steady hand that anchored them both. "How did you do that?" Richard asked, his voice a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Isabella met his gaze, her dark eyes filled with a depth of understanding he couldn't quite place. "I listened to her," she replied simply. "Children with special needs often don't have a voice, not in the way others do. But if you listen long enough, they begin to show you the world through their eyes." She paused, looking at Clara, who was now resting peacefully, her tiny hand still reaching out as though tracing the lingering echoes of Isabella's song. "Clara has a beautiful soul, Richard. She just needs someone to understand her, to be there without judgment." Richard felt something stir deep inside him. He had spent so many years trying to solve Clara's problems with logic, with medical expertise, and with his wealth. Yet, here was Isabella, someone with no special medical training, someone who had experienced profound loss herself, offering something far more valuable than treatment. She was offering connection. The truth was, he had never truly connected with Clara in this way, not in a way that allowed her to just be herself. His mind was a whirlwind of realizations. "You've been through your own pain, haven't you?" Richard asked softly, finally finding the courage to ask the question that had been lingering in the back of his mind. "How do you know what she needs so well?" Isabella hesitated, a shadow passing over her face as she looked away. She took a deep breath before responding. "I lost my daughter, Lucia. She had cerebral palsy and autism. She was just like Clara in many ways. The doctors told me she wouldn't be able to do many things. They said she wouldn't talk, never be able to take care of herself or even recognize love." Isabella paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But Lucia taught me the most important lesson of all. No one knows a child's potential better than the child themselves." Her voice softened with a tender resolve. "I didn't know how to make Lucia better. I just knew how to love her, to listen to her, and to teach her to embrace the world with what she had." Richard's chest tightened as he processed her words. He understood the depth of the loss Isabella had experienced, losing a child, the kind of loss that could break anyone. Yet here she was, standing before him with an unwavering strength, and a heart that had learned to heal not just herself but now Clara as well. She had turned her grief into a gift. Clara's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Isabella, will you sing again?" she asked, her tiny voice trembling with innocence and trust. Isabella's eyes softened as she knelt beside Clara, her hands gently brushing through Clara's hair. "Of course, Clara. What would you like to hear?" Clara smiled faintly, her small hand reaching out to touch Isabella's arm. "A song about the stars." Isabella nodded, her voice soft as she began to sing again, this time a gentle lullaby that spoke of stars and dreams, of the mysteries of the night. Richard watched, feeling something inside him shift. Clara was more than just a child, with special needs. She was a beautiful soul who had never been given the chance to show the world what she could do. It was clear to Richard now that he had been so focused on fixing Clara, on finding a solution, that he had never taken the time to truly see her, to see Clara for who she was, not what she lacked. As Isabella sang, Clara's face brightened. For the first time in months, she was no longer consumed by fear. She was listening, learning, and absorbing the music with an openness Richard had never seen. Her mind was a vast universe full of potential waiting to be unlocked. Isabella was teaching her not through force, but through love and patience. And in that moment, Richard realized something. He had been so caught up in his world of wealth and business, trying to control everything, that he had forgotten the most important thing of all: to listen, to simply be present for his daughter. Richard's heart swelled with something new, a deep gratitude for Isabella, a recognition of her gift, not just to Clara, but to him as well. She had opened his eyes, and through her, Clara was beginning to open her own. Later that evening, as Richard sat by the fireplace, a thought began to settle in his mind. He had spent years seeking perfection, chasing success, and building his empire. But here, in his home, he had found something far more important: a chance to build a real family, a family based on love, patience, and acceptance, not appearances or wealth. He had made a decision. It was time to protect his daughter, to fight for her future, and to make sure that she would have the chance to live fully. He could see now that Isabella's presence had transformed not just Clara, but the entire household. Richard had come to a quiet understanding. This wasn't just about Clara's future, it was about his too. The following days in the mansion unfolded with an almost unspoken change. Clara's mood had shifted dramatically, and the atmosphere in the house grew warmer, more alive. The laughter that had been absent for so long returned with full force, and the once somber halls were now filled with the soft sounds of piano notes and Isabella's gentle, reassuring voice. But as the days passed, Richard found himself increasingly curious about Isabella's past, about what made her so calm, so understanding, and so capable of bringing out the best in Clara. She wasn't just a caretaker, she was a healer. One evening, as Richard sat in his study, he glanced out the window and noticed Isabella standing in the garden with Clara, her hand gently guiding Clara through the rows of fragrant flowers. For the first time in his life, Richard felt an overwhelming sense of peace in his home. It was as though Isabella's presence had somehow washed away the years of emotional neglect. But it left him with questions. Later that night, after Clara had gone to bed, Richard walked into the library where he knew Isabella would be. She was sitting at the desk, organizing some old music sheets, her movements deliberate and quiet, as always. There was something calming about the way she worked, like she didn't need to rush, as if she was at peace with herself. Richard hesitated before speaking, his thoughts finally giving way to the question he had been avoiding asking. "Isabella, can I ask you something?" he said, his voice softer than usual. She turned to him, her dark eyes reflecting the warm lamplight. "Of course, sir," she said, her smile gentle but knowing, as if she had already sensed what was coming. "You've been with us for a few weeks now, and in that time you've had such a profound effect on Clara, on all of us. But there's something I've been wondering. You said you've been through a lot in your life. I need to understand you more. What made you so capable of doing this?" Isabella put down the stack of papers and looked at Richard, her gaze steady but not without a touch of sadness. She took a deep breath, the weight of the past clearly still with her. For a moment she didn't speak, as if collecting her thoughts. Finally she broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "It's not something I talk about often, Richard, but I'll tell you. I used to live a very different life, one full of hopes and dreams until they were shattered by the loss of my daughter Lucia." Her eyes softened as she spoke the name, as though it still carried a heavy weight, even after all these years. Richard could hear the grief in her voice, but also a quiet strength. He sat down across from her, listening intently as Isabella continued. "Lucia was born with cerebral palsy and autism. The doctors told me she would never walk, never talk, never be able to live independently. But those words didn't stop me. I fought for her every day, trying everything from therapies to unconventional treatments, anything to help her grow. But no matter how much I tried, there were limits to what she could do, limits the doctors had set. But Lucia taught me something very important. Richard's heart tightened as he listened to Isabella's words. He understood now. Isabella didn't see the world through the lens of normality or limitations. She had learned to see potential, to see the value in every individual, no matter the challenges they faced. Lucia taught me that miracles happen when you refuse to believe in limits, Isabella continued, her voice steady. She may not have been able to do everything the doctor said she couldn't, but she taught me that even the smallest progress was worth celebrating. Even if she couldn't speak in full sentences, her laugh was the sweetest sound I ever heard. She may have been different, but she was my world. I loved her more deeply than I can express. And when I lost her, it was as though a part of me was ripped away. Richard could feel the weight of Isabella's pain. He had always feared losing his own family, but he couldn't imagine the depth of the sorrow she had endured. But despite her loss, despite the pain, Isabella had learned something invaluable, something that had taken her through the darkest of times and into the light. When Lucia passed, I thought I would never find happiness again, Isabella admitted quietly. But I knew that the only way I could honor her was to continue the work I had started with her, to help other children like her. I became a teacher, working with children with special needs. I traveled to Europe and Mexico, learning new ways to connect with these children and to help them express themselves. But even more than that, I learned how to love without expecting anything in return. Richard felt a deep admiration for Isabella. He had never heard someone speak of their grief with such grace, such patience. It was clear now. Isabella wasn't just a woman who had faced unimaginable loss. She had taken that pain and transformed it into something beautiful, something that had the power to heal. I lost Lucia, yes, but I also gained a deeper understanding of what it means to truly care for someone, to be patient, to listen, to help them find their own way, Isabella said, her voice now filled with a quiet conviction. Richard was struck by how much he had taken for granted. He had been so focused on solving Clara's problems, on fixing her, that he had never stopped to think about just being there for her. He hadn't listened to her the way Isabella had. Isabella had shown him that healing came from connection, not from intervention. It wasn't about fixing Clara, it was about understanding her, embracing her as she was. And now Clara, Isabella continued, turning her gaze back to the young girl who was now resting peacefully in her bed. She is like Lucia in many ways, but I believe she too can find her own path, just like Lucia did. It's not about curing her, Richard. It's about helping her discover the world in her own way. Richard sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Everything Isabella said seemed to resonate with him on a deeper level. The way she had approached Clara's care, the way she had taught him to slow down and see Clara for who she really was, not who he wanted her to be. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this, Richard began, his voice filled with new resolve. I can't keep going down the path I've been on. I have to change. And Clara? Clara deserves the chance to live her life without limitations, without fear. You've shown me that, Isabella. Isabella smiled softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We'll figure it out together, Richard, one day at a time. For the first time, Richard felt the weight of his world lighten. He had found not just someone who could care for Clara, but someone who had reminded him what it meant to truly love, to truly listen, and to embrace the beauty of what others offer, even when it seemed impossible. The days that followed brought a quiet transformation within the Albright mansion. The sprawling halls, once filled with a distant coldness, now echoed with the sounds of life. Clara's laughter, long absent, had returned in full force. Her once closed world of darkness and fear was slowly being replaced by a realm of discovery and curiosity. Isabella's presence had opened a door to a new reality for both Clara and Richard, a reality where healing didn't come through pills or medications, but through patience, empathy, and understanding. As each day passed, Richard couldn't help but notice the subtle but profound changes in his daughter. Clara was beginning to thrive. Her smiles were brighter, her giggles more frequent, and her once limited interactions with the world around her had blossomed into new experiences. In the mornings, Richard would often find Isabella and Clara in the garden. Isabella taught Clara about the plants, the smells, and the sounds around them. Richard would watch from a distance, marveling at the way Isabella connected with Clara, not as a caretaker, but as a companion. She didn't rush Clara through experiences. Instead, she allowed her to explore at her own pace, validating each tiny step forward. From the way Clara would touch the rosemary leaves to the joy on her face when she recognized the scent of mint, Isabella had opened up a world of senses and emotions that Richard had never known Clara was capable of experiencing. In the evenings, when Richard returned from work, the once somber mansion was now filled with the sounds of music, Clara's piano playing in the background, the soft melodies drifting through the air. Richard would pause in the doorway of the living room, a sense of gratitude filling his heart. The house, which once felt hollow and empty, had become a place of warmth. Isabella had created a space where Clara could grow. But more than that, she had shown Richard how much he had missed in his pursuit of success and perfection. But not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. The tension between Vanessa and Isabella had been building ever since Richard had overheard their conversation. Vanessa, as beautiful and polished as she appeared on the outside, was finding it increasingly difficult to hide her disdain for Isabella's influence over Clara. To Vanessa, Isabella's approach was a challenge to her own role as a mother, and she couldn't stand the fact that Clara was responding more to Isabella than to her. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Richard returned to find Vanessa in the living room, a glass of red wine in her hand, her expression cold. It was the kind of silence that Richard had grown accustomed to since their marriage had begun to unravel. He could see it now. The divide between him and Vanessa had grown too wide to ignore. It wasn't just about Clara's needs anymore. It was about the truth, about what mattered in their marriage and what didn't. "Richard, we need to talk," Vanessa said, her voice sharp, as if she had been waiting for him. "This whole situation with Clara has gone too far. I've been patient, but now, it's just unbearable." Richard felt a familiar surge of frustration rise within him, but he held it back. Vanessa had always been a woman of appearances. Everything was about maintaining a perfect image, the house, the lifestyle, the people they interacted with. But in all this, the one thing that was supposed to matter most, Clara's well-being, had been lost. "What do you mean, unbearable?" Richard asked, his voice steady but firm. "Clara's improving, Vanessa. She's laughing, she's engaging. For the first time, I see her becoming the person she could have been." Vanessa's eyes flashed with annoyance. "No, Richard. This isn't about improvement. This is about you being completely blind to reality. Clara will always be different. She'll always need someone to manage her, control her, and that someone isn't Isabella." Richard's chest tightened. Vanessa's tone, the way she dismissed Clara as a burden, those words stung like a slap to the face. He had been so focused on building his empire that he hadn't seen the truth of their marriage, the emptiness in their relationship. He had been blind to the fact that Vanessa had never truly loved Clara, not the way a mother should. Clara, in her eyes, was simply an obstacle, a flaw in the perfect life she had created. "What do you want me to do, Vanessa?" Richard asked, trying to hold back his anger. "You're telling me to send my daughter away to some institution, to take away the progress she's made, to throw away the chance she has to live a normal life." Vanessa's voice hardened. "I'm saying, what's best for her? She needs to be in an environment where they can fix her, not with a maid who thinks singing lullabies and playing games is going to make everything better." Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Vanessa was beyond reasoning. The woman he had married was incapable of seeing Clara as a child, as a person who deserved love and care. She saw her as a problem, and in doing so, had lost the capacity to love her. "Clara isn't broken, Vanessa. She's not a problem to fix," Richard said through gritted teeth. "She's my daughter. She deserves better than this." The silence between them was suffocating. Then, with a sharp sigh, Vanessa stood up, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "I'm done with this conversation. If you can't see the truth, then maybe we're done. Richard stood there, watching her leave, the words echoing in his. And it was clear now. The marriage was over. He had a choice to make. Clara's future or the illusion of a perfect life with someone who would never accept her. The next morning, Richard made his decision. He couldn't live in a house divided. He had to stand up for his daughter, and he had to do it without the constraints of a marriage that had no foundation of love or understanding. "Isabella, I need to speak with you," Richard said, finding her in the kitchen, her hands busy with preparations for breakfast. He was nervous, but he couldn't ignore the pull he felt. Toward her, toward the change she had brought into his life. "What's on your mind, Richard?" Isabella asked, looking up from the counter. He took a deep breath, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. "Clara stays. You stay. Vanessa will leave." Isabella's eyes softened, and she gave him a small nod, the weight of their unspoken bond evident between them. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Richard knew this was the right choice. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with the decision he had made. The future was still uncertain, but for Clara and for the family they were beginning to build, it would be a future full of possibilities. He was finally free from the expectations of others, and he was ready to fight for the life his daughter deserved. The days following Richard's decision passed with a kind of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The tension in the house was palpable, but there was something strangely liberating about the choice he had made. As he woke up each morning to the sound of Clara's laughter and the soft melody of Isabella playing the piano, he felt a deep sense of peace, the kind of peace he hadn't known since the tragic death of his first wife, Emily. Isabella had continued her work with Clara, not just as a caretaker but as a mentor, guiding Clara through every new experience. She taught her to play music, to engage with the world through touch and sound, to find joy in the simplest moments. Clara's transformation was undeniable. She was thriving. But despite the progress Clara was making, the tension with Vanessa had not dissipated. Richard knew that there was no turning back. Their marriage had reached an irreparable point. Vanessa had never truly understood Clara's needs. Her refusal to accept Clara's uniqueness and her constant desire to fix her had exposed a truth Richard had been too afraid to see for far too long. His daughter was not a burden, and he could not live in a marriage where his love for Clara was not supported. As Richard sat in his office one afternoon, the familiar buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was a message from Vanessa. "I'll be leaving tomorrow. I've made the arrangements. You'll hear from my lawyer soon." Reading the message, Richard felt a mix of relief and sadness. This was the final step in letting go of a life that was no longer his. The perfect, idealized world he had once strived to build with Vanessa had crumbled. He no longer had to hide behind the facade of a perfect family. The only thing that mattered now was Clara and the family they were building together. As Richard sat back in his chair, the full weight of his decision hit him. He had chosen love over appearances, understanding over control, and most importantly, he had chosen his daughter over everything else. The reality of his decision was overwhelming. He knew that this would not be an easy road ahead. There would be battles to fight, but it was a battle worth fighting. He was ready to face the future, whatever it might bring. That evening, as Richard made his way to the garden to meet Isabella and Clara, he was struck by how different everything felt. The mansion, once an emblem of his wealth and success, now felt like a home, a sanctuary filled with love, acceptance, and warmth. The once cold and lifeless space was now alive with the sounds of laughter, music, and the soft, gentle whispers of family. Clara was playing the piano, her small fingers dancing over the keys with the grace of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Isabella was sitting beside her, offering guidance without overwhelming her. The bond between them was evident. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken language that transcended words. Clara was no longer the anxious, fearful child she had been when Richard first brought Isabella into their lives. She was blossoming, and Richard could see it with his own eyes. "She's incredible, Isabella," Richard said softly, his voice filled with admiration as he watched Clara. "You've given her something I could never give her." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes filled with a gentle understanding. "I didn't give her anything, Richard. She's always had it in her. I just helped her see it." Richard nodded, feeling a deep gratitude for the woman who had helped him find clarity in the most uncertain of times. Isabella's presence had brought the light back into his life, and with that light, Clara was learning to see the world in ways Richard never thought possible. Later that evening, as the three of them sat down to dinner, Richard made an important decision. He had promised himself that he would make Clara's future his top priority, and now he had a clearer vision of how to do that. "Isabella, I've been thinking a lot about what you've done for Clara, and I want to offer you something," Richard began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to hire you as Clara's full-time tutor and mentor. The pay will be more than what you're earning now, and you'll have complete freedom to design her education and activities. I want to make sure Clara has everything she needs to grow and thrive." Isabella looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Richard, I don't know what to say. That's an incredibly generous offer. But—" She hesitated, her gaze flickering, to Clara, who was sitting quietly at the table, absorbed in her meal. Richard reached across the table and took Isabella's hand. "You've already done more for Clara than I could ever have imagined. I want you to stay with her, to continue being the person she looks up to, the person who makes her feel safe and loved. If you're willing, I want to make this a permanent role for you." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "I would be honored, Richard. Thank you." In that moment, Richard knew that this was the right decision. He was no longer fighting for appearances, for perfection. He was fighting for his daughter's future, for her happiness, and for a family built on real love, not pretense. The house, the wealth, the success, they all paled in comparison to what he had gained. He had a family that mattered, a family that would always stand together, no matter the odds. As they finished dinner, Richard sat back in his chair and watched as Isabella and Clara exchanged stories and laughter, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt at peace, knowing that his choices had brought them to this point. In the days that followed, Richard's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. The business was no longer his sole focus. It was Clara and the family he was building that took precedence. He started working from home more often, spending his days in the garden with Isabella and Clara, watching them grow and learn together. Richard had made the choice to protect the future of his daughter, and in doing so, he had found the true meaning of family, the kind of family where love and understanding were the foundation. As he stood by the window, looking out at the life he had built, Richard knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, stronger, united, and more determined than ever before. The sun dipped low behind the Beverly Hills skyline, casting a warm golden glow across the Albright mansion. Richard stood by the window, watching as Clara and Isabella played together in the garden. The eyesight sound of Clara's laughter carried through the air, clear and bright like the music of a child finally allowed to be free. The transformation in her was nothing short of miraculous. Richard had never imagined that a small, simple change in perspective could create such a ripple effect, one that had touched Clara, Isabella, and even himself. For years, Richard had focused on building his empire, seeking success at any cost. But now, with Isabella's quiet influence, he had found something far more valuable than wealth. He had found peace, purpose, and a family that was whole. Watching Clara and Isabella interact, Richard realized that it wasn't the financial empire he had built that defined him. It was his relationship with his daughter and the love they shared that truly mattered. Isabella had done more for Clara than Richard ever thought possible. She had brought not just stability but joy into their lives. Through her patience and compassion, Isabella had shown Clara the world in a way that went beyond what the medical experts had ever promised. And in doing so, she had helped Richard see what he had been missing all these years: the power of connection. The quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of Clara calling from the garden. "Dad, come look!" Clara shouted, her voice filled with excitement. Richard smiled and walked outside, his heart light. He found Clara and Isabella sitting on the grass, both of them holding something in their hands. "Look, Dad," Clara said, holding out a small flower to him. "I found it all by myself." Richard knelt beside her, taking the flower in his hand. "It's beautiful, Clara." His voice was thick with emotion. For the first time, Clara was thriving, not because of her condition being fixed, but because she had been given the space to truly be herself. Isabella smiled at Richard, her eyes full of understanding. She didn't need to say anything. Her quiet presence spoke volumes. In her, Richard had found not only a caretaker for his daughter, but a partner who understood the importance of love over perfection. "You've both made this house a home again," Richard said, his voice filled with gratitude. He looked at Clara and Isabella, a sense of peace settling within him. "Thank you for everything." Clara hugged him tightly, and Isabella's smile was all the affirmation he needed. As the evening settled in and the family gathered around the dinner table, Richard realized that true wealth wasn't in the riches he had amassed, but in the love he had rediscovered. The mansion, once filled with emptiness, was now alive with laughter, music, and hope. Richard had chosen the path of love, and it had led him to the greatest treasure he could ever have imagined: a family, not bound by blood, but bound by a shared commitment to love, acceptance, and understanding. And, in that moment, Richard knew this was only the beginning.